Hello and welcome to the Blue Collar Wealth Club podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jerry Garcia.
I am your other host, Sheena White. Today we're going to talk about the beginning stages of buying a business. We've kind of referenced it a few times on this podcast that we are in the process of looking at businesses to purchase, primarily in the trades. And we just wanted to share kind of the stuff we've been going through in trying to buy a business.
Yeah, there's an early beginning stage of that process. You know, I do a lot of digging online, posting in a lot of online buy-sell groups for businesses and just seeing what's out there. We've been contacted by some private sellers. We've found some that we've dealt with some brokers, and each of those has their own unique challenges. We just wanted to kind of dig in and talk a little bit about what some of those challenges are.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess from my perspective, one of the things is the first business we looked at was just a private seller. That one I think could have been great, but the thing was the private seller had kind of unrealistic expectations of valuation and how all of that works. And so that's kind of why that deal fell apart.
Kind of digging into some of the non-specifics of that deal, but kind of why we didn't end up moving forward. Talk about the valuation a lot, and the reason there was a disagreement on what the company was worth. We could get into talking about how many hours the current owner was putting into the business.
Yeah.
How long they'd owned the business. He hadn't owned it that long. I guess let's start there with the amount of hours that were being worked by the current owner.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big thing whenever you're going to buy or sell a business, right? If you're going to sell a business, nobody wants to buy your job. And if you're going to buy a business, you probably don't want to buy somebody else's job, right? You're trying to buy an asset. And so if you have a business and you're thinking, okay, maybe one day I want to sell this, I think that should be really the number one thing you look at is, can my business survive without me? Because if you're integral to the day-to-day management of that business and it doesn't operate without you, that's going to be not only really difficult if something were to happen to you, but also super difficult to sell. And that was one of the main reasons. Like, that wasn't a total deal breaker for us, but it was kind of a hesitation.
Sure. We happen to be in, the fortunate position where our plan for this initial business, I have the opportunity to hop in full-time if needed and actually operate. That allows us to do is get a better deal, right?
Yeah.
We're able to kind of look at businesses where normally those multiples you're paying 4, 5, 6x when you're buying it as an owner who doesn't have to be in the day-to-day.
Exactly.
We're looking at businesses now, 2.5, 3, maybe 4x multiple, depending on the business. And that's kind of where the nuance was for this particular transaction. I think he was working pretty full-time in it, and then as they ramped up and started to even see even more business, was now putting more hours. The seller still wanted to get those higher multiples, but had the kind of characteristics of a lower multiple, which is kind of where things fell apart. Like I said, we can do that, which is great. Not everyone wants to do that. Not everyone should do that. But we can hop in right now with me as an operator full time, really dig in to get a better deal on this first business while we continue shopping for additional.
Yeah, but if you're listening to this and you're thinking about selling a business going forward, like your own business, and you want to sell it, obviously we're talking about that's going to have us spend less on this business. So again, you really need to focus on becoming just an owner, not an owner operator, because the minute you you keep that operator status, whoever you're selling it to gets to pay you less.
That's an important difference in how you shop and how people are shopping. So if you plan on selling your business at some point, you should start building it now the way that you want to have it built when you're selling it, because there's a lot of time between there. And if you get in a position where you now have to sell sooner rather than later, you're just going to be stuck in a position where
you get less.
You're going to have to sell it for less. I mean, there's really no other option.
Yeah, and you really need to start thinking about the saleability of your business 3 to 5 years out, because it's a 3-year look back on taxes, especially for like SBA underwriting. If you're going to sell it to someone who's going to get financing, if you're not prepping your business for that sale and for underwriting through the SBA, then it won't be able to be underwritten. Therefore, you won't be able to get somebody who has financing, and then you're probably either going to have to sell or finance it, also get less.
Yeah, so that was one kind of major component in this deal. Luckily, it was a private sale, so we were able to kind of negotiate back and forth without a lot of lag, which is something we can talk about on another deal that we have been looking at. Just a lot of back and forth. We kind of sat with the seller, discussed what was important to him, if we can come to agreement on terms, and ultimately we were able to make an offer that we were comfortable with, but the seller was not comfortable selling at that price. And a big part of that goes back to him having only owned the business for less than 2 years at that point in time, which is great. The business had been around for 10 plus years, but him having been the owner only for 2, and that's really when they saw a lot of their growth. The previous owner really hadn't done a lot to scale up that business. This particular seller had hopped in, did a great job getting some growth in there. Everything was looking good. It's just there wasn't enough of a history, and he really wanted to focus on the recent growth rather than factoring in the kind of more flat past.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing where it's like consistency, right? So I talk a lot about the book, Great by Choice. In the book, they have a whole chapter on the 20-mile march where it's like basically just creating consistency in your business, creating growth, but growth that is sustainable, right? And that's where we came in. We're like, yeah, you've had this explosive growth, but that's really, for my perspective as a potential buyer, it's really scary.
Right.
Because now I'm paying for this explosive growth, but I don't know if I can sustain it or if it is even sustainable. Like, do you have the infrastructure to sustain that? Like, obviously you're working a ton more, so you really don't. So then what is the infrastructure to sustain that growth going to cost? There's a lot of question marks there, and every question mark in a buyer's mind is not good. Think about if you're selling a house, the potential buyer, they don't want to not know if you have the correct wiring or not know if your roof is good. They have an inspector come in and make sure all those things. It's the same with your business. You don't want less question marks for a continuation plan for a potential buyer, the better. And I feel like that's kind of where I got a little uncomfortable, was just not knowing if we could sustain that long term because it had been so explosive so recently.
Well, and that's what I was going to get into next, the continuation plan, because it's important not only to see that there is a plan in place, like, hey, we've seen this growth, here's how you can continue that growth, and here's what we've done, here's kind of the next steps. The more you can lay that out for the buyer, the more comfortable they're going to feel paying more multiples. And we're talking multiples of either SDE, which is seller's discretionary earnings, or the EBITDA, which is the earnings before income, taxes, depreciation, amortization. These are the calculations we use. Basically, the profit of that company for that period, and then paying a multiple of that. If that company's, let's say they're bringing in $2 million a year, but the profit's only $500,000 in a really good, well-run, oiled machine already, where you just have to buy it and make sure you're communicating with your managers. We might be paying 5, 6, 7, 8 times that amount, 3 to 4 million possibly. Or in a business where you have to step in and do a lot of the work, we're talking about 2 to 3 to 4 times. So maybe anywhere from 1 million to 3 million at that point.
Yeah, at the very most, So there's a huge divide, right? In how much you're getting paid, depending upon how the multiple. And then also smaller businesses is usually seller discretionary earnings, and bigger, it's usually the EBITDA. But could argue that too. Like, what is seller discretionary earning? Like, what is considered an add back? Like, oh, this isn't actually useful in the running of the business, but is it or is it not? And so sometimes there can be argument there. Like, I've seen people say, oh, well, it's my truck, and so I'm going to keep my truck, but I've been paying my truck payment through the business. But the thing is, if you're using that truck every day for business purposes, then as the new owners, we're going to have to go buy another truck.
Right.
So my argument would be that it doesn't. I mean, yeah, okay, you can keep that equipment, but that technically is a business expense, and I'm not going to do an add back for SDE on that because I'm going to have to replace that asset, and I'm still going to have that outlay of cash every month.
We talk about the continuation plan, but it's important to have a history there too. In this particular case, the owner hadn't owned it for 2 years, which is fine. Like I said, a lot of growth in that time frame, but we just didn't have the history of seeing, hey, here was our plan, here's what we did, here's how we executed it. You can see we kind of hit our goals here. Now we've built a new plan for the next 3 to 5 years that you can buy right now and take over. And that's no fault of the sellers. It's really just that they just hadn't owned it long enough yet, which is why when you're looking to sell, ideally, you have already started this and already kind of implemented some of this plan, executed some of this plan, hit some goals. The more goals you can hit, the more you can show that your plans in action have worked, the better you're going to get on the sales price for that business.
It's interesting that you bring that up too, because another thing is really important is your key performance indicators. Are you tracking things like, are you tracking how many leads you bring in? Are you tracking your close ratios? All these different levers in your business, like, are you actually tracking it and paying attention? Do you have attribution for this increased success? Because if all of a sudden it just explodes and you don't know why, you can't actually recreate that because you didn't know. It's kind of like with penicillin guy, I can't even remember his name, but he just magically found penicillin and then he had to figure out how to recreate it, and it actually took him a long time to figure out how to recreate it. It was just kind of like, what the world? And so we don't want that in our business, right? We want to be tracking things to have attribution to our successes so that we can show ourselves going forward, but also a prospective buyer, like, okay, here's the formula for how we got to where we're at, and here's the formula to get to that next level too, so that they can see that vision and they're buying not just these parts, but they're buying a company that has a vision and has a path to a future success.
I mean, the beauty of all of this, right? All of this tracking, all of these numbers, these things that we're talking about, if you're doing these in your business for the intention of selling it, it actually just helps your business in the interim as well.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, everything is, the reason that it makes it so saleable is because it makes your customer experience repeatable, which is the biggest thing, right? You've heard this before, and maybe if you haven't, when talking about McDonald's, people don't go to McDonald's because they have the best hamburgers. They go because, first of all, there's one everywhere, because you know what you're getting into, right? You know, every time you go to a McDonald's, more or less, you're going to get the same exact things. McDonald's was one of the companies that kind of revolutionized that and said, hey, we can get your burger from here to the counter, from order to counter in, under a minute. And it's because they created these processes. They created actual tools and technology to make sure that, hey, boom, press this button, it gets everything you need on a cheeseburger, and then it's ready to go. Yeah. They create everything until, down to a T. The more you can do that with your business, the better it's going to be for the buyer. I mean, all in all this is just painting as clear a picture as possible for the buyer so that they can take over and it can be as seamless as possible. The clearer that picture is, the more money you make on it.
Well, because the easier it is for them, right? Nobody wants to, the whole point of buying a business is you're not trying to reinvent the wheel. You're just trying to buy somebody else's wheel. And so if you have to go through the painstaking process of creating processes, then why pay someone? Like, you can just go do it yourself.
Right. And that's where some people get into trouble, right? They think they have a saleable business. They find out that they're way too involved and there's nothing written down on paper, and there's really no benefit to buying that business except for maybe the customer list and maybe some of the equipment, right? Depending on the type of job it is. Yeah. I mean, if they have equipment, otherwise there's really not that much benefit from just going out and getting an SBA loan to start that same business and build it from scratch. That's why it's important to know, where is your customer base coming from? How much repeat clients do you have? How much is your marketing bringing in? How much is past client referrals? And all of this stuff is important to track because it's all valuable. I mean, anybody can start a business and then go turn on pay-per-click ads, and then, as they're doing well, they can just crank up that money and spend more to bring in more dollars. But if you're not tracking it, you don't know how beneficial that actually is to your business.
Yeah. Well, and then, if you are doing like pay-per-click advertising or things like that, and you're not actually collecting that and creating a database, like, data these days is gold.
Yeah.
It is the new currency. And having a database of humans and potential clients that you can retarget that database and all these things, that's super duper important. I mean, why is Meta and Facebook making as much money as they are? It's because of the amount of people on their platform.
It's Google, it's Facebook, it's Amazon.
It's all about the data. It's all about the users. If you are servicing, say, 50 to 100 clients a month, and you're not really doing anything with that. Like, I had a client who he had been in his industry for years and servicing clients, and he had never collected any of the data. And I was like, what? Because he was in an industry that you could potentially service the same client multiple times. They would need you a lot. And I'm like, what the world? Like, you're telling me you're talking to 5 to 10 people a day? If you think about that for a whole year, multiple years, that's a huge amount of data that had just been left on the table. And as you're building your business, you want to create that database. You want to, not to spam people, but to have that customer interaction and that connection to get referrals, to get repeat business, to get new services, whatever. You just want to be connected to your clients.
It's hugely valuable, more valuable than people realize. That was kind of our experience with, I'd say, the first business we looked at. We had a second business we've started looking at that this one was on the market dealing with a broker. And when we talk about like selling your business at the right time, this one was an example of not having planned ahead and been very good at their taxes, meaning they weren't paying a lot of taxes. But what does that mean? That on paper, it doesn't appear that business cash flows that well, which is great for taxes for not having to pay many, but not great when you want to now sell your business and realistically, it doesn't look like it's making money. Now we can see kind of through the curtain a little bit and understand that this is a valuable business to buy, which is why we're so interested in it, but we're getting it at a huge discount for that reason.
Yeah, we have the money to put down and all that stuff, but we don't have the cash flow to just like write a check for the whole thing. That would be awesome, but not true. Then it becomes a complication because SBA is like, okay, this business isn't cash flow.
Right.
We can't underwrite it. Now it's like, okay, now how do we bridge that divide, find the money?
There are different options. So what happens when you have a business that looks like a great deal because it's not cash flowing on paper, but you can see that there's a lot of potential there and there's a lot of room for improvement. So what do? SBA won't finance it because it just doesn't appear on paper that it's making money. What options are there? The first option you go to is, okay, well, is the seller willing to finance this? Put some money down. We'll agree to terms on an interest rate, the length of the term, and we'll pay it back over time. And then you come up to terms of like, okay, now is this person staying on board? Lots of things to discuss in that. That's usually the easiest route to go. But the seller's taking on some risk there, hoping that you're going to execute the plan that they put in place for you, or that if they hadn't, that you have for yourself on how to build this business and make sure that they get paid back. Because right now they're acting as the bank. If you come in and do a terrible job, they have to take the business back over and either try to sell it again or try to scramble and put it back in order so that they can sell it.
And I actually know someone personally that they had a tea shop, and like where you could go to like high tea, and then they sold teas and all this stuff.
Okay.
And
I was going to ask what a tea shop. I wasn't sure if it was like a manufacturing thing or
no, like an actual, like you could go and drink tea and then buy tea.
My daughter had a tea shop when she was...
Well, they had a tea shop. It was very popular and they sold it, but they had to do seller financing. And the new owner was terrible. Just ran it into the ground, literally just gave it back to them. But at that point, they had sold everything. They had gutted it. They basically gave them back the business, but it was worth nothing. And then it just shut down and it was a loss. There is risk to a seller. There truly is in seller financing. You have to make sure you're selling to the right people and you're willing to take on that risk because you're the bank.
So yeah, if you're shopping, if you're in the market to buy a business from a seller and asking them to finance it, then you have to sort of ease their mind, put together a plan like, hey, here's the plan, here's what we're going to do. You have your scheduled monthly payments. You need to make them comfortable with A, that you can afford the payments even during downtimes, B, that you have a business plan to take over this business and really make it thrive and make sure that they get paid back. You have to know how long that term is going to be so they know that, hey, look, I want to be made whole by X date, whether that's 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, depending on the seller. They'll have their own comfort levels. If they want an interest rate for loaning you this money, I've heard of deals where the seller didn't charge any interest, which I think is silly, but I've heard of it happening. Most sellers are going to want to charge an interest rate, ideally one that's less than the current market that you could get from SBA. There's just a lot less red tape, but there's a lot more risk to them personally. Some sellers are okay with saying, okay, well, you would put down with 10% with SBA. I'm comfortable with that because I know the business. I know that it's going to be hard for you to run it into the ground. Other sellers are going to say, look, I'm going to want more money down to be comfortable. Other options as well, which we can get into, something that we're exploring for this particular purchase.
Doing some alternative financing and capital raising and all that fun
stuff.
Sure.
I mean, you could take on a single or several investors and say, look, we're willing to treat this like a loan. You loan us this money, we'll buy the business. The seller is then basically getting it in cash. We will pay back the investors X amount of return over X amount of years. And then you have to get into terms of like, okay, well, what happens if you're late on a payment? What happens if you default? Do we have any equity in the business? Do we have any voting rights in the business? There's lots of different ways to put it. Talking straight just debt, it's just a giant loan from several investors. You're talking equity. Why don't you get into that aspect of it a little more? Because that's definitely more nuanced and more complicated.
equity. If you're giving equity to people, that means that they also own it with you. If you give them too much, they can
vote
oust
you out.
you
Yeah.
of your own business. I had a business partnership before, and I always joke around now that 2 against 1 ain't fun, because I had 2 business partners and we each owned a third, and some stuff happened. It was an unfun situation, and while it was bought out, I still one day owned a third of a company, and the next day did not, that I had built, and that sucked. That was not fun. That was really terrible. You have to be really careful in giving an equity position away, right? And in giving an equity position away, if you're the one doing the day-to-day management and you're giving that equity, it's also that they're getting just as much benefit as you in terms. So say you own 75, they own 25. If you grow it 100%, they own 25% of that growth.
Right.
You have to be really specific on who you're giving an equity position to. I prefer debt over equity, but sometimes people don't want to give their money away without the equity. They want to buy a piece of it too.
Yeah, and you got to know who you're getting into business with, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's going to be key. If you choose to take on equity partners, that's fine. There's definitely a place and a time for that, especially if they can offer you some other strategic benefit. If they have a good network in the field that you're purchasing that business in, then great. You come on board, you give me some capital, I'll give you a piece of this business. Let's grow it together. Let's make money together. You can lean on them when you need something. The opposite can be true too. You can give somebody a piece of this company, they can offer you nothing more and say, look, I gave you your money. I'm not going to do anything else to help this. You need to make sure that I get paid back, and your job is to grow this thing. You really have to be careful on how you're doing it and what your overall plan is and what makes the most sense for you.
Yeah. And anytime you're going to bring on an equity partner, recognize that, in my opinion, business partnerships are like, it's akin to a marriage. You need to know who you're dealing with, and especially with new regulations coming out all the time, like who you're in business with matters, and what they do affects you and what you do affects them. So you really don't go into it lightly.
Absolutely. Anything else we want to hit on this topic?
Said all the things that were depressing. So.
This is something we can revisit multiple times, because as we continue along this journey of buying businesses, there's always going to be more to talk about. And we figured this was a good time. We're in the midst of this now, and the plan is to continue to be in the midst of this over and over and over again. We'll give you some of the down low on what we have come across and what's important to us, what we're hearing. There's always a story to tell.
Yeah. And as we get further and further, we'll continue to share and what we're finding and what we're learning, because that way you guys can know more, and maybe some of the stuff we're running into you don't have to deal with in the future.
Shorten that curve for you a little
right?
bit. Awesome. Well, that'll do it for this episode. Thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you next time on the Blue Collar Wealth Club podcast.